So stay with me, and we'll try to get it done. In fact, it's possible that we may have to leave some of what I plan to do today till next time, but maybe not. I think we should be able to cover it. We're going to focus today, as the title says, on the festival of Purim. And I think that Purim is a vastly misunderstood holiday in terms of its importance, its significance, and the messages that it teaches. So that's what we're going to take a look at from an overview today. We begin with a rabbinic debate and a question. The rabbinic debate actually is not of practical halachic significance this year, but the question is, when do you observe, the Gemara asks, when do you observe Purim during a leap year when there are 2 months of Adar? Now, you know the answer, but that's not the issue. The issue is that there is a machlokas. There's a difference of opinion. Difference of opinion between Rabbi Eliezer and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi says you should observe Purim during the first month of Adar. Why? Very clearly because of a rule that applies across the board in halacha, ein ma'avirin al hamitzvot. You don't pass a mitzvah by. You don't let it go. In other words, as soon as you have the opportunity, in other words, to ein machmitzin al mitzvot is another phrase. You don't let the mitzvah become chametz. Basically, you have to grab it. You have to do it. And therefore, since this is our first opportunity and a leap year is the first month of Adar, that's when you should observe. Reb Shimon Gamliel says, no. Mesamech geula legeula adif. It's more important to have the redemptive story of Purim juxtaposition to the redemptive story of Pesach. And therefore, you have to keep Purim close to Pesach, and you have to observe during the second month of Adar. Now, the question is really very real. Rabbi Yossi is quoting a rule that we follow constantly throughout the Talmud, throughout halacha. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says you have to keep these two stories close to each other, but I'm not quite sure why. Purim and Pesach could not be more different. Purim is a rabbinic festival. Pesach is a biblical festival. Purim you can do work on Purim, you can't do work on Pesach. There's all sorts of differences between the two. Oh, my son gave us the answer? All right. So, oh gosh. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, I'm gonna give an answer at the end of the shir, and if you'll tell me if my son's answer, all right? And if not, then we have a machlokas. That's real nachas. Okay, so we're going to leave that question. We're going to say why do we agree with Rav Shimon ben Gamliel? Why do we overrule Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi? And why do we observe during the first month of Adar? Second month of Adar. We'll come back. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to peg Purim as a paradigm. And by way of explanation, let's first review when Purim occurs during the history of our people. All right, so Purim, of course, if you run through this historical timeline very quickly, it's very simple. It's not detailed at all. Patriarchal period, Egyptian slavery, Exodus and desert wandering, conquest of Canaan, Judges, United Kingdom, all of those are different periods of our history. Babylonian exile is the period right before Purim. So let's understand. We're basically going through this timeline, the patriarchal period, the period of slavery in Egypt, the Exodus and desert wandering under Moshe, the conquest of Canaan under Yahushua, Shoftim, Judges. What happens after Yahushua dies is that there's no real central government. There's tribal governments. And during the period of Judges, different heroes rise to protect the Jewish people after they fall into potential tragedy over and over again. United Kingdom, there are 3 kings who rule over the United Kingdom. They are Shaul, Shlomo, David, and Shlomo. Shlomo's death, the kingdom tragically divides into the two countries or the two populations of Yisrael and Yehuda. The Yisrael disappears, is basically conquered by Assyria and spread throughout the world. What's left is Yehuda. We are the descendants of those who were in Yehuda and those who might have escaped and came back and stayed with Yehuda. Babylonian exile ends the period of the Judean monarchy. And what happens then is that at the end of that exile, Persia conquers Babylon. And Persia says, Cyrus says, you can go back. Go back. You have every right to go back and rebuild your temple. Now, there's some complications, but you can go back. How many Jews go back? How many? Less than 10%, right? And that's much less than 10%. Given the opportunity to go back to Israel, the Babylonian Jews primarily decide to stay in exile. Why? In Borough Park, all right? Right. It's like my wife said, she said, she quotes a comment that was made to her about that, and she said, why aren't you thinking about Aliyah to a friend from Brooklyn? Why do I need to go to Israel? I have Borough Park. That's the tragedy. That's the tragedy, right? So this is a critical juncture. This is a critical juncture of Jewish history. It's the moment when the exile of choice becomes the exile of force becomes an exile of choice. And if you turn the page, you'll see that there are 3 points that I believe happen at this moment.
Can I just ask one question?
Yes.
Is it appropriate for us in Israel to be saying things to the
Is it appropriate to us?
Because they're probably different opinions.
Okay. All right.
Maybe it's
You're asking whether it's appropriate for us to lobby for Aliyah, right? And even interpersonally. So that's a complicated question. I don't think we should make people feel guilty, but I do feel we should talk about the importance of Israel and the importance of living here, and as much as we can, encourage people to do so. Okay. Anyhow, Babylonian exile changes the galut from force to choice. The Babylonian exile changes from galut of force to choice. At this historical juncture, Purim appears, and through it, God educates his nation. This is the world in which you choose to live. Purim will show you what that world is all about. Purim emerges as a paradigm of confrontation with outside world for diaspora communities across the ages, and now for the Jewish state confronting the community of nations.
What does paradigm mean?
Paradigm means a model. It means an example. Now, that we have seen Purim as a paradigm can be proven from the list before you, which is not complete. I just have a small list. Over and over again throughout Jewish history, various communities experience near tragedy, are saved, and they have a holiday. They make a holiday. And what do they call it? Purim. Purim of Ancona, Purim of the Bandits, Purim of Cairo, of Hebron. These are all stories that are wonderful stories to learn, but they are all the same in one regard. That is that near tragedy, redemption, celebration, Purim. And even you see at the bottom, you see not only communities have their own Purim, but families have their own Purim. Basically, families that had near tragedy were saved and celebrate. So we see Purim as this paradigm. This is not a new idea. And now we need to see what that paradigm teaches us. What are we learning through Purim about our existence in Golus? Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The only two times ever recorded Hadira is it says Yerushalayim Hadira, and they called Shushan Hadira.
Interesting. Only two times that.
The Jews before the Holocaust said that Berlin is their capital,
Right.
like Jerusalem.
Correct.
So the Jews of Shushan.
Okay, good. We'll talk about that. Yes, they saw Shushan as the Bira, as you say, as the place to be.
What is the source of these different Purims?
The source of these different Purims you can see in the Encyclopedia Judaica, probably online now. I saw it in a book. And this is not a complete story, not a complete list. There are many more. I just put those down as examples.
I thought you were going to say Megillat Tanit.
No, all right. It's in Encyclopedia Judaica, maybe even Megillat Tanit, but that's not where I found it. All right. Continuing realities that are taught to us by Purim concerning living in our world. Number one, 2 words in the Megillah that capture our attention. They've become a song. V'nahafoch hu. What does that mean? Turned around. Sudden change. We are living in a turbulent, uncertain, vulnerable experience when we live in Golus and when Israel confronts the outside nations. Nothing is steady. We can't be relaxed. Why? Because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And if anything has taught us that, our experience over these last few months tragically has taught us that. And in some ways positively has taught us that when we look at the fall of certain dictators, et cetera, instantly changed. Purim story, consider it. When the Purim story begins, we're riding high. We're celebrating in the palace of Achashverosh. Suddenly, we're about to be killed. Suddenly, we're saved. Over and over and over again, Purim teaches us, if you're going to choose this exile, then that's what you're choosing. Next. This is the moment, and we've said this before in other contexts, thank you. We said this before in other contexts, and that is, this is the moment when HaKadosh Baruch Hu stops speaking to the Jewish nation. In other words, he spoke and stopped speaking in the patriarchal era, stopped speaking with Yosef. He returns and speaks to Moshe through Nevi'im over and over again until you roughly get to this point. This is the end of the prophetic era. Now Hashem is hidden, right? And open Nisim. Now Hashem is hidden. We have to see his hand in what seem to be normal events. The rabbis tell us this in a very beautiful way, in a strange way. And it's, again, how the rabbis capture your attention and tell you something profound. The rabbis ask, Esther min HaTorah minayin. It's on your sheet. How do we know about Esther from the Torah? Page number 3. Right? How do we know about Esther from the Torah? So it's a kind of a strange question when you think about it, isn't it? The Torah is written how many centuries before the Purim story? So how can I find an allusion to Esther in the Torah? The rabbis answer, V'anochi haster astir panai bayom hazeh. God threatens that if we deserve punishment, I will hide my face on that day. But what's the word used? Haster, words used, haster es, right? What does that sound like? Esther. All right, so the rabbis say that is an allusion to this moment of history, the story of Esther, when God will hide his face. Next. Very strange comment made by the rabbis that unfortunately too many young people take extremely literally, all right? And that is, of course, number C, Omar Rava, Machayev inish livisume bepuria, a person should become so intoxicated on Purim, Delo yada ben arur hamon levaruch Mordechai, to the point where he can know or she can no longer distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Now let's stop for a minute. First of all, let's yep.
He's the second one. In other words, it wouldn't be less Mordecai instead of.
You're putting Laurel Home and Fush. Yeah, right. Okay, that there may be reasons for that, but the key issue here is number one. There's no mitzvah in getting drunk on Purim. All right, and we should teach this to young people. If we want to fulfill this mitzvah, the halachists say, drink a little more and go to sleep, and then you won't know the difference between Aror Haman and Baruch Mordechai. In other words, the point being that how this is fulfilled should be done in a non-dangerous fashion, and unfortunately, it becomes dangerous. Okay, putting that aside, I have a very simple question. This is not characteristic of Chazal. What? They want us to get to a point where we can see the difference between Aror Haman and Baruch Mordechai? Why?
I always thought of it as you can't really judge events. You don't know what the end is.
Okay, you can't.
So
Very good. Very good.
Events,
that ties into the first thing we said. Right. Right. That ties into what we said about a vulnerable, changing existence. But I think it goes even further. You live in a world, when you choose to live in Galus, you live in a world that does not distinguish between Aror Haman and Baruch Mordechai. Period. Finished.
That doesn't
Right?
answer the question.
Wait. Okay. And why do you have to get to the point? Because you have to touch that, you have to see that world. You have to experience, you have to admit it. You have to get to a point where do I have to say anything about that, given what's going on in the world today? Right? What, Hamas freedom fighters? Gays for Hamas? They would step into the Gaza Strip. They would be killed by Hamas. Let's understand. The UN, right? It's a farce.
And how does getting tipsy clarify the issue? It never makes sense.
It's the issue because it is the Chazal wants you to experience what your world is, meaning that to get to a point where you can't distinguish between good and evil. Why? Because the world doesn't. And you have to,
How does that add to anything positive?
it adds to a recognition of the reality.
Exactly the point. How does being tipsy add to your understanding of
Okay,
reality?
how does being tipsy add? So my answer to you again is there's no mitzvah in getting drunk. But putting that aside, right, okay, tipsy. The answer is this is the world you live in. And therefore, at least this is what it means to me. This is the world you live in. See the reality. Get to the point where you can't distinguish. And then when you go back to that world, you'll realize the evil of the world. You'll
You need that to realize it?
maybe, but Purim is teaching that. Look, the answer is yes. The answer to you is yes. Do I need that to realize it? The answer is yes, because everybody would come on Aliyah if they really realized it. All right? So the answer, and even for us, we need to experience it. We need to know that that's the world. That's the world. Next. All right, we'll come back to it, if you want, but let's keep going. The next truth. These are basic truths concerning exile existence, a fragmented nation. You have to listen to your enemies because they tell the truth, right? Sometimes, right? How does Haman describe the Jews when he speaks to Achashverosh? It's on your sheet. Am echad mufuzar umeforad bein ha'amim. Right? They're scattered. They're vulnerable. They're not together. Achashverosh. You can take care of them simply. Just they're divided, and that makes them vulnerable. There are those who say that October 7th occurred when it did because our enemies knew we were vulnerable and we were divided. We were arguing with each other very, very vociferously, and that creates vulnerability. All right, so that's number one. Number two, as part of this fragmented nation, if you look at the mitzvos of Purim, there are two that don't make sense at face value. Su'uda makes sense. Megillah makes sense. That ties into Purim. But how does giving gifts to the poor tie into Purim? I'm supposed to give tzedakah year round. Why is there a special obligation to do it on Purim? And Mishloach Manos, what does that have to do with anything, right? I'm giving you a box of hamantash and fruit. What do you need it for? And why am I doing it? The answer, I believe, is it's the answer to the fragmentation. You're building community. You are building community through those mitzvot. And that is what Esther and the Mishloach Manot occurs in the Megillah. It's found in the Megillah, mandated by Esther and Mordechai. And that's essential lesson from the holiday that we learn. And finally, number 3, it's just as an aside, Purim is the only holiday that from the onset is different strokes for different folks, right? In other words, from the beginning, some people will observe on the 14th, some people will observe on the 15th, right? So and not only that, the Mishnah says in the days when they used to come back to far-flung farms and towns, used to go to the cities to hear the Megillah, you could read it earlier than that and later than that. In other words, it was a big window. So that demonstrates our fragmentation. It demonstrates it's the only holiday where we're not always doing the same thing on the same day. And it's telling us that fragmentation is inevitable in this world. What? The Dom Tov Sheni shall go. Yeah, Dom Tov Sheni shall go. I said from the outset. That's what I said. Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliot is not an essential component in the holiday. It's something that comes about because we have a problem in determining a date. This is essential to the holiday. It comes right from the start. So fragmentation is mirrored. And finally, what? I'm sorry. The beginning of Amalek is when we started. Okay, good. All right, same idea. That is that we become vulnerable when we're complaining, when we're arguing, when we're... All right, next. Eyes and hearts towards home. Let's talk about Shushan Purim and Purim for a minute. What's the rule? All cities that are walled cities celebrate what? On the 15th, on Shushan Purim. Unwalled cities celebrate on what? 14th. Right. Okay, good. Got it. Okay. Why? Because the Shushan, they had an extra day to fight, and they only celebrated on the 15th. Everywhere else, they stopped fighting on the 13th or finished fighting on the 13th and celebrated on the 14th. Fine. So that's okay. So every walled city, like Shushan, now when would you think, in order for this halacha to become practical, you have to define a walled city, right? You have to define when does that city need to be walled in order to be considered a walled city, like Shushan. So what's the cutoff? You would think it's the Purim story, right? The rabbis come along in the Gemara and they say, no. What is the definition of a walled city? Any city that was walled from the time of Yehoshua, the time of the first conquest of our conquest of Eretz Yisrael. Objection, the rabbis say. Shushan was not walled at the time of Joshua. So what did the rabbis answer? Shushan's the exception. Hold on a minute. I have a rule that is created because of Shushan that doesn't apply to Shushan because it's the exception to the rule. That doesn't make much sense, but it does. I'm coming to, right. What are the rabbis saying? The rabbis are saying that this is a diaspora holiday. It really is. It's a diaspora festival because it occurs totally in Golos. And we remain in Golus after it's over. That's why one of the reasons we don't say Hallel on Purim. Along come Chazal and they say, if you're living in Golus, your time still has to be defined by Eretz Yisrael. And when you celebrate, has to be defined not by your Golus Shushan, but by the moment when we first entered and conquered the land. And that's what will determine when you celebrate your festival. You will celebrate it based upon what? Eretz Yisrael. So that brings us back to the issues we were talking about concerning Aliyah. Now, okay, so those are fundamental truths which I believe are embedded in this festival, and they are very serious truths, very sobering truths, and Purim, for all its fun and games, conveys these truths. If that's true, I believe also that all the characters of the Megillah are paradigms as well. Now, what do I mean? Don't get me wrong. They were real people. This is a real story. But every one of them represents a certain character that is familiar to us over the course of our history. Let's see what they are. Haman, he's the easiest. All right? What does Haman represent? Evil. Amalek. Now, what is the characteristic of Amalek? What makes someone Amalek? Reasonless hatred. What do I mean by that? The Torah says, Asher korcha baderech, they happened upon you on the way. You weren't entering their territory. You didn't ask for water like you do with other communities and nations. They had no reason to attack you at all. They see you, attack. What does Haman do? Reasonless hatred. Mordechai refuses to bow down. What would a normal bad person do? Kill Mordechai, right? What does Haman do? Kill all the Jews. Makes no sense, right? It doesn't make any sense. That's Amalek. That happened in the Holocaust too, right? That this is Amalek. This is Amalek. Next, Mordecai. All right, Mordecai. What does Mordecai represent? The hero, right? The one who stands and confronts the evil. But there's a complication concerning Mordecai. The rabbis, the Megillah says, Mordecai lo yichra v'lo yishtakabeh. He's not going to bow down to the Haman. Let me ask you a question. Halachically, if I live in a city where there is a king, am I supposed to, and the law is you have to bow down to the king, am I supposed to bow down halachically? Yes. The answer is yes. So here we are in Persia, right, where Achashverosh has appointed someone and said, you have to bow down to him. And Mordecai doesn't. And by not doing it, he endangers, and he couldn't have known this, he knew he was endangering himself, but because of that, he endangers the whole community, the whole nation. So why doesn't Mordecai bow down? No, I say, I said that. I said he had no way of knowing that he would endanger the community. He was endangering his own life, though. That he knew, right? So why doesn't he bow down? The answer is there are red lines that you don't cross. He turns and says, the likes of Haman, I know who he is and what he is. I can't bow down to that. Even if the law says I have to, I can't bow down to that. The rabbis say in the Gemara that Haman had an avodah zarah around his neck, and bowing down to him, bowing down to that. You can take it literally, or you can say that Haman turned himself into an avodah zarah. Haman was someone that Mordecai simply could not bow down to. Now, what does that tell us for us? That there are red lines in our world too. And those red lines you cross at your own danger. We define them all the time in our lives. What I'll allow in my house, what I won't allow in my house, what I'll allow my children to see, what I won't. Red lines. Everyone has their red lines. There's a red line now that was crossed, unfortunately, by a representative from the USA who sat down to talk directly with Hamas. That's a red line. The red line was you don't talk to terrorists directly. You don't. And he says, well, I'm trying to get to the human side of them or something like that, right? I'm quoting, we laugh. It's simpleton, right? But it's in danger. What he may come to an agreement that will force Israel to do things that Israel doesn't want to do. So, yes.
When you cross red lines, then the red lines don't seem so red afterwards.
What?
So
when
you cross red lines,
right.
The red lines are
That's correct. When you cross red lines, they don't seem to be red lines anymore.
The red line before that said don't negotiate with terrorists.
Right.
We went over that red line.
Okay, right. Correct. The argument might be, and you can argue back and forth, that we were giving in too much to them already. But whatever. It's an argument. Esther, who is she? What does she represent? Esther is a martyr. Esther is the one who gives her life for the Jewish people. Everyone else at the end of the Megillah is out in the street celebrating. Where's Esther? She doesn't get out. There is a moment in the Megillah where there's a phrase that underscores this, and that is when Mordecai convinces her to go to the king. Basically, she says, get all the Jews together, they should pray for me, don't fast, etc. Asher avadati. So what does that mean? Simple explanation is Kesara Sarah, right? What if I'm lost, I'm lost. Say Chazal, no. She is saying to Mordecai, at this moment, when I decide to go to the king of my own volition, until now I was forced, I'm deciding to go to the king of my own volition. And when you go to the king, it's just not for tea and crumpets, right? You know what's going to happen. Therefore, I'm lost to you. I'm lost to my people because I'm now in a position where there's no return. And we have to shed a tear for Esther on Purim, or on Tanis Esther maybe, because we have to recognize that as brilliant a heroine as she was, she ultimately becomes a martyr, as have so many Jews tragically across history. But now we come to my favorite. All right, my favorite is Achashverosh. All right, those of you who read my article in Torah Tidbits, this will be somewhat of a review, but I want you to see it anyway. All right, Achashverosh. What do we normally say about it? What's the popular way of viewing Achashverosh? Fool, simpleton, right? Why a fool? Why? Because everybody manipulates him, right? The rabbis debate it, by the way. The rabbis say some say he was a fool, some say he was a pikeach, very, very cunning. Okay? I believe cunning. I believe he was cunning, deliberately making himself like a fool. What do I mean by that? What you see in Achashverosh is seen throughout history. And that is the kind of king who only cares about what happens in the palace, what happens outside, doesn't touch him. Now let's see it. Let's start with the first. Haratzim Yatsu Dechufim. Number 4 on page number 5. Haratzim Yatsu Dechufim Bidvar HaMelech Vehados Nitna B'Shushan Abira. Right? The messengers went out with speed, bringing what? The news of the potential that you're going to, the right that is given to the non-Jews to kill the Jews on such and such a date, right? V'Haman v'Hamelech v'Haman yoshvu l'shtos V'ha'ir Shushan navoch. Haman and the king are sitting down and drinking, and the city of Shushan is in consternation. Now, it doesn't say the Jews are in consternation. It says the whole city. Why? Put yourself in the position of a Shushanite at that particular moment, right? You're told that in such and such a date, months from now, you are allowed to kill your neighbor. How do I live for the next 6 months? What do I do? Do I borrow sugar from her? Do I talk to her? Do I see her on the street? What's supposed to happen over these months, given what you're telling me? Shushan Navocha. Shushan didn't. If you tell me I can kill him tomorrow, that makes sense. But setting a date and then saying, okay, now go live your lives. And what does the Megillah paint? The king and Haman are sitting down to drink because not my business. Doesn't touch me. Next. Mordecai. Mordecai comes, and what does he do? Mordecai cries out in the streets, and he comes to what? Up to what? Up to Shar HaMelech. I'm trying to see if I didn't have this down. Yeah, I should. Yes. All right. No. Yeah. Okay. Yes. The second, I skipped it. The second point on page number 5. Ki ein lavo el Shar HaMelech bilvush sak. Because you can't come into the Melech's courtyard in what? Clothes of mourning. Why? Everything in the palace is light and happy. Parties. You don't bring your mourning into my palace. You don't bring your mourning into my courtyard. You want to mourn? Mourn. But it doesn't touch me. That's Achashverosh. Let's go on. Esther says to Mordecai, and we take this as a given. We don't even think about it. Esther says to Mordecai, I can't go to the king because there's a rule. And the rule is that if you go to the king and he sees you without being bidden, you're going to be killed, execution. Unless he extends his sharvid hazahav, his scepter, and then you live. Well, hold on a minute. Wouldn't it be nice to wake up in the morning and say, today, I only want to see Yankel and Shmerel and anyone else who shows up, I don't want to see them. All right, I'm going to kill them. What's going on here? What's going on is he's creating his reality. He's trying to fashion his day, and he's saying, I will determine who I will see at the cost of their lives. Just understand that. Right? And I'm going to determine and shape the environment in which I live, and only the people that I want to have are going to be in that environment. Next thing that happens, it's not as direct. All right? On page number 6, Balayla hahu nodadosh nasamelach. The king can't sleep. Why? What's going on? The more you try to create that world, the more paranoid you become. It's a rule, right? Because you have to work harder and harder to maintain it. And how does he go back to sleep? They read to him from the annals of his kingdom. Right? Put me back in that world. Put me back in the world where I'm in charge. I can't sleep because I'm not sure it's going to be safe. But it's only when we come to the climax of the Purim story, where you see the evil of Achashverosh hugely. All right? Let's go. Esther is at the party with Haman and Achashverosh. Esther says there's one person who's going to He's threatening to kill my nation, etc., etc. The king says, who? She says, Haman. What does the king first do? What's the first thing he does? He runs away, right? He runs away. He goes out into the garden. It's right there in the Megillah. It's on page 6, the bottom of the page. Why does he run away? Because this is a worse nightmare. The outside world is encroaching on his world. Now, it's not just encroaching on his world, it's threatening his queen. Oh, I can't deal with this. He comes back in. What does he see? Haman supplicating himself before Esther, lying before Esther. Right? The king says what? Are you going to seduce my queen in the palace? Now let's stop for a minute. Do you think that the only thing on Haman's mind right now is the seduction of Esther? Right? Come on. I mean, he's 1 foot away from the gallows, right? So do you think that Achashverosh really thinks that Haman wants to seduce Esther? I don't think so. What he is doing is he's rewriting the problem. It's no longer a problem dealing with a group, right? It's one man. Haman is trying to seduce Esther. What do? Kill Haman. And once I kill Haman, then what? I'm finished. That's fine. Everything else goes back to normal, which is why on the next page, all right, it says, Vatosef Esther vatedaber lifnei hamelech vatipo lifnei raglo vatech vatischanen lo. Esther has to go to the king and plead and cry and go down before his feet. Wait, what's going on? She knows her king. She knows her husband. She knows that as far as he's concerned, finished, gone, no problem. Haman's dead. So she has to beg him. She has to beg him to repeal the edict against her people. You want to know what she's really saying to him is, I'm not going to leave you alone unless you do this, right? She's his wife. I'm not going to let you. And the real miracle is that Achashverosh doesn't kill Esther, right? In other words, he loves her so much that he's willing to live with her under those circumstances, which is not Achashverosh-like. All right, so what then happens? It really gets clearer. What then happens? What then happens is he listens to Esther, and he says what? He says, I can't repeal the edict. Why can't I repeal the edict? Because a king's edict can't. Why? Because the king is infallible, right? It would be an admission of mistake. It would be admission that my first edict, wasn't right. So I got to have another edict. So what will I do? I'll issue another edict. Now, what is that edict he's issuing? What is it? You can fight back. Hold on a minute. The king is mandating civil war in the streets of Shushan and throughout the empire. You can kill them, you can fight back, have a good time, right? Doesn't touch me, right? Doesn't touch me. And he doesn't care. He doesn't care that they're killing each other, that blood is running through the streets of his empire, because he doesn't care. That's Achashverosh. Achashverosh represents an evil that in some ways is as great as Haman's evil. He represents a world that doesn't care. And how many times have we encountered that as well, right? How many times has the world been silent when we've needed the world, right? How many Jews were not allowed to leave Germany? Not because the Nazis wouldn't let them, but because what? The USA and other countries wouldn't take them in, right? Correct? Achashverosh is that world. Haman cannot exist unless you have an Achashverosh. Haman cannot exist unless the world is willing to be complicit in what happens.
You say that Achashverosh was cunning, but surely if he was cunning, he might realize that the results of civil unrest to that extent might also affect him.
Okay, good point. Good point. They answer it. All right. So the objection is that if he's cunning, then he would realize that civil unrest will eventually touch him. I don't think he thinks that. I don't think he thinks that. I think he's going to. I'm going to continue to control, and as proof, guess what? It doesn't topple the empire, right? There's this civil war. People get killed. Showing.
The Emperor of Japan, the same kind of way. He saw what was happening, but he couldn't. He's in his position was such a high that there was nothing going on that mattered.
I mean, during World War II, the Emperor of Japan. Okay. There are kings throughout history that are like Achashverosh, right? There are benevolent kings who have audiences with their subjects, and there are kings like Achashverosh who want to have their own world and don't care what happens outside the walls.
It's happening today because people in the outside world are not seeing that.
It's happening today, right? In other words, people are, and what's happening today is even more active. It's negative, but this is evil. This is real evil, because Achashverosh basically says, "Go ahead and kill yourselves, and I don't care." So, having said that, that's when I say Achashverosh is my favorite. It's not because Achashverosh is good and I like him. It's because I think that the clues that emerge from the Megillah about him are often ignored. And when you see the reality, it's part of history repeating itself. Now, next page, a frightening, final, continuing reality. Right? Let's go back for a moment to the moment when Mordechai asks Esther to go to the king. Esther's first reaction is, "I can't." What do you think Mordechai's argument would then be? Esther, how can you stand by and let your brethren die? You were in a position to help. That's not what he says. Look at what he says. He starts off, Al tidami benafshech lihimaleit beis hamelach mikol haYehudim. What does that mean? Don't think you're safe. Don't think that because you're in the palace, you will escape the fate of all the Jews. It's going to hit you too. Now, isn't that a strange way to begin? In other words, Esther, I have to tell Esther, don't think you're safe. I should say to Esther, you got to do the right thing. So I believe, and then he does afterwards. He then says, who knows if it's not for this moment that you became the queen. So what do I think's happening here? Again, my interpretation. Mordechai is frightened. Because when you live in the world of Achashverosh, there are two dangers. One danger is you will become a victim. The other danger is you will become like them. All right? In the Torah, we see this with Lot and Sodom. That's a whole nother discussion. Mordechai is frightened that Esther has been in the palace too long. And therefore, instead of arguing with her about doing the right thing, how does he argue with her? Don't think you're safe. And then we learn that Esther is who Esther is. But recognize that is a moment when we view the other danger of living in an Achashverosh world. Finally.
Where do we see that Esther refuses? From the very first time that Mordechai tells her what she says,
No, she says that. No, that's the second time. No. The first time in the Megillah, look at it again. First time in the Megillah, he says, you have to go. She says, I can't because the king will kill me. Right. And then he says this. Right? So it's the second time. All right, now let's go back for just a moment.
What's meant by the second time?
What?
What's meant by the second time?
The second time, what she says to Mordecai, she responds to him twice concerning the request to go to the king. And the second time he convinces her. All right, now let's stop for a minute and come back. I bet you didn't remember the question that we started with. Turn to the first page. All right. We wanted to determine a defense for Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's position that you have to keep Purim close to Pesach. And it's so important that you do that you even overrule a rule. That's throughout halacha. Overrule a rule. A rule. And the rule is you don't pass by a mitzvah. And that's a rule. And you're overriding it because you want to keep Purim close to Pesach. Why? Because it's the challenge of every era to see itself against the backdrop of the totality of Jewish history. Purim is one moment. What makes it great is because Mordecai and Esther see their story not just as a story of a bunch of coincidences, but they interpret it as God working through the normal course of events, and they see it as a story that will enter the Jewish flow of Jewish history. What's our challenge always? To determine what's our contribution, not to this moment, but what's our contribution to the totality of Jewish history? What will people remember about our era? These are all questions that we should be asking. And therefore, I think that's why Purim has to be close to Pesach, because Purim shouldn't be in isolation. Purim is a story of one moment in Jewish history or one time in Jewish history. It shouldn't be left alone. It shouldn't be an orphan. It has to be seen against the backdrop of the totality of Jewish history. And I think that's why we will celebrate on the leap year in the second month of Adar. Okay, we'll stop there. Any question? We got a couple of moments. Any questions? And then what?
I'm bothered by the last sentence in the Megillah.
All right.
You're
bothered by the last line of the Megillah? All right, because he's Ratzuri the Rovechav and not the Kolechav, that he's liked by most of, right? Because you know what? They're being honest. They're being honest. There's nobody in a political position that is going to be acceptable to all. I think that's what it's saying. That's part of our problem. Correct. We're all right. It's the reality. All right.